We begin tonight with lawmakers saying they are close to a deal to avoid a possible government shutdown. House and Senate negotiators have agreed on what they call a framework. That's an important word we'll get to in a second for a long-term spending package. Congress has until Friday night at midnight to avoid a partial government shutdown. The House is set to take up a short-term measure today that would extend funding for a week, that to buy lawmakers more time to negotiate. For more on this, I'm happy to be joined here at the table by CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane. Scott, catch us up. Framework is not a deal. Framework is the outline of a deal. That's why it's an important word, frequently used in Congress but not fully understood. Framework is a great distance from a deal. How close are they?
Only in Washington is framework considered progress or some type of Herculean accomplishment. It's like having a grocery list and you got the first item, you bought the eggs. You have to do the rest of the shopping still. Yes. So they have some numbers they're throwing around today. We've heard about $800 billion for military spending, defense spending, maybe another $800 billion for everything else. And that's always the balancing act, right? That's where the distance is. Republicans want to skew this more towards military, less on domestic, and Democrats may be pushing for the other way. They've kicked the can down the curb. They're on a trajectory to punt this deadline from December 16th, from Friday to next week, to buy themselves more time. But I'll note this. The House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, emphasized several times today he's concerned about any of this, saying the two lead negotiators in the Senate, Pat Leahy, the retiring Democrat from Vermont, Richard Shelby, the retiring Republican from Alabama, are both gone at the end of the year. And House Republicans don't like that two retirees are deciding how to spend hundreds of billions of dollars.
And just for the audience's understanding, this would be for the entirety of the next fiscal year, correct?
This would buy them all the way through September 30th. The alternative, if they can't iron something out by a week from tomorrow, is that they do something shorter, 1 month or 2 months, which changes the calculus politically so very much. With House Republicans taking the majority in January, going through this again in 2 months gives them wildly more leverage, and Republicans are very aware of that. Perhaps why Senator Mitch McConnell says we're not talking past the 22nd about a long-term deal. We'll do something short then.
So, speaking of leverage, Kevin McCarthy, who may or may not be the next Speaker of the House, but he is the leader of the House Republican Conference, talked about this. Let's listen.
We're 28 days away from Republicans having the gavel. We would be stronger in every negotiation. So any Republican that's out there trying to work with them is wrong.
So that
why
includes
wouldn't you
Mitch
wait with the
McConnell?
hand
Does that include McConnell?
Yes. Why would you want to work on anything if we have the gavel inside Congress?
The sentiment is, we're powerful when I hold the gavel. We don't know if he's going to hold the gavel, and we don't know how powerfully he will be able to wield that. One of the things I understand, Scott, that is on Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate's mind is, wait a minute. Yes, we will have more leverage in theory, but in practice, if McCarthy can't get anything across the finish line, then there is no government funding, there is a shutdown, and all Republicans therefore get blamed.
And do you want to get jammed up at the start of a new majority with something like this, where you can't even get your soldiers in line on keeping the government open and keeping the lights on? So there's some incentive for Republicans to cut a longer-term deal. But it really is foreshadowing what is to come, where baseline blocking and tackling of government may become tricky. True with government spending, but I still see that big red flag planted in the middle of the field ahead, which is the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling was something the Democrats wanted to tend to before the end of next week, get it out of the way preemptively to prevent a catastrophe next year. They quite simply haven't done it. They didn't have the bandwidth or the time. They've left that big red flag sitting there for a House Republican majority, which may not have the votes to do it themselves. And last time this came up, they gave no votes to Democrats for them to get it passed.
Can they put that into a long-term spending deal should they achieve one?
There was an assumption that they would try. In fact, the congressmen and congresswomen-elect were urging them to try to get this off the playing field. Haven't heard a whisper about that being synthesized in there.
Scott, one of the things that happens in negotiations like this, it's not only about spending, it's about what else you might put in this piece of legislation, because it must pass, and things that must pass have a gravitational pull to them, taking in unrelated issues. One of them is the Electoral Count Act. You talked to Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, a lead proponent of a Senate bill on this. Tell us what she had to say.
Well, she's recognizing what you just said. This is the last train out of the station. You got to put on the train whatever can fit. The Electoral Count Act is something that is so obscure and so unfamiliar until January 6th, when it was highly relevant. exercising these challenges to the electoral count partly gave rise to the space and time for the insurrection. They want to modernize this bill, update it. They think they can get it done on this spending bill. Here's more of what Senator Klobuchar told us earlier today.
The whole thing was set up for kind of pomp and circumstance, and it turned into a day of destruction. And you just can't have an antiquated law that was, drafted in the 1800s, in the Rutherford B. Hayes days, back when women could even vote. They couldn't even vote back then. So we're simply updating the law.
Two big things. She says she has the votes, Senate and House, to get this done. So it looks like it's on a glide path. The big difference, as it was in 2021, just one member of the House and one member of the Senate need to object to string this whole thing out and block the electoral count of a state and have a debate. It would raise that up to 20% of the House, and 20% of the Senate would have to object, especially in the Senate. That's a much higher threshold.
So, Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, made reference to a time in America where women couldn't vote. Well, there was a time in Washington where there weren't women in the Senate. Now there are. Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, Democrat, made headlines last week switching her party relationship from Democrat to independent. That prompted some to think she might be trying to avoid a primary challenge on the Democratic side. Our colleague, Bob Costa, talked to Ruben Gallego, Arizona congressman, Democrat, about whether or not he might challenge Kirsten Sinema either way. Let's take a listen to that.
How likely is it that you run for the U.S. Senate?
Look, I'm not going to give percentages on that. What I can tell you, because of the nature of who I am and what I do, I always prepare. So we've been putting the team together to make sure that when I make that final decision, we're going to be able to press enter and just go.
How do you frame this possible matchup?
Well, I think the possible matchup is a responsive senator versus a non-responsive senator. There is nothing independent about selling out, the agenda, the Democratic agenda for, hedge fund managers.
Scott, let's translate that for the audience. And I'm not even sure we need to go very far in the translation business. I'm the kind of person who prepares, and if I decide and I push the button, we're ready to go. That sounds like you're getting very much ready to go. Oh, what's the possible framing of this campaign? He already has the framing in his mind and has stated it in that interview. What does it sound like to you?
No earthly idea how that race would play out with Kirsten Sinema running for re-election as an Arizona independent, as she characterizes herself, with a Democratic nominee and a Republican nominee. That's the type of thing we don't see often, and it's hard to predict or give you a predictive model of what happens next. But I'll tell you this, talking to any number of staffers and members of Congress, they don't see the political complexion of this Senate changing with her change from Democrat to independent.
But when you listen to Ruben Gallego, is there any doubt in your mind that he's preparing to run?
And he was leaving breadcrumbs even before Kirsten Sinema made her announcement that a primary was in order here. Clearly the Democrats want to run somebody against Kirsten Sinema. Now they can do so in a less cumbersome way.
Mm-hmm. And that mention he made of not representing Democrats but representing hedge fund managers, I believe is a reference to something that Senator Sinema did in the final negotiating stages of the Inflation Reduction Act, correct?
Yeah, and the Inflation Reduction Act was really where we saw Kirsten Sinema at the epicenter of the debate. She's been a pretty much a fulcrum on a lot of these big issues, but that one, really, the rubber hit the road through her. And Democrats are clearly forecasting how they'd run against her, but how do you run against her and a Republican at the same time? I don't see how that plays out.
What is the latest, Scott, on the January 6th Select Committee and its intentions and timeline?
Their next and final public meetings Monday, going to be Monday afternoon if passed as prologue. Then they issue their report Wednesday, and Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren in the past week has said they're also going to release all of their work, all of their findings, potentially, all the transcripts. And therein comes something that may be very difficult to navigate immediately. It may take some time to go through that and find all the nuggets that are worthwhile. So you have a report, you have their work product, and you have a hearing, all of which are happening on the precipice of a holiday.
Because this matters in the symbolic sense, it may not matter in the legal sense. If, in fact, there are criminal referrals from the January 6th Select Committee, would we be likely to hear about them Monday or Wednesday?
The chairman of the committee has told us that's likely to happen Monday, but it also would be something they probably could synthesize into their final report. But that might be what Monday really is all about, based on what the chairman told reporters earlier this week.
And on that list, we might likely expect to see which names?
He won't answer that question.
The most persistent question currently asked outside of the budget negotiations.
And us asking it each hour doesn't seem to grease the skids to get an answer.
Hasn't dislodged anything yet.
It would be more surprising than not if Donald Trump's name wasn't on there. I mean, he's been the epicenter of their investigation. They continue to echo the statement of a federal judge from California who, during one of the pieces of litigation in their investigation, said it's more likely than not Donald Trump conspired to obstruct an official proceeding.
Scott MacFarlane, our congressional correspondent, thank you so very much.